Rutendo Benson Matinyarare, please give us a small intro of your organization.
Thank you, Gambakwe. How are you tonight?
I'm honored to be with you. I call you a patriotic legend.
All right. I've got two organizations, by the way, Mr. Gambakwe. There's the first one, that is Zimbabwe Anti-Sanctions Movement. Zimbabweans Unite Against U.S. War Sanctions. And then the second one is Zimbabwe Anti-Sanctions Movement. So the first one is the one that I started in 2018. And we felt that the issue of sanctions was just not getting as much attention as it should. I felt that Zimbabweans were in danger of a country that was going to be destabilized, sabotaged, and eventually people in Zimbabwe divided by negative publicity, economic strangulation, economic problems, to eventually start fighting internally, opening up room for intervention by the West, like they did in Libya, Iraq, Syria, Yemen, Afghanistan, and destroyed those countries. And I'm a person that would love to retire in my country. I'm a person that would like to retire on a piece of land, even in my rural areas. And I would like to do that without being a slave or a servant to any of the former colonizers that used to colonize us. So when I realized the problem that was happening, the sanctions that were undercutting the fiber of our society and morality, I decided to do something. And the something that I decided to do was to start creating awareness, information, and knowledge to the Zimbabwean people that the sanctions were the biggest threat that we had as a country. There were discussions about corruption, and corruption is our problem. I looked at it, and no corruption had ever brought down a single country since the beginning of the nation state. But sanctions had brought down almost every country that doesn't exist today, because they always start off as blockades, economic warfare that almost always results in a war and invasion by foreign forces. The American sanctions themselves, every time they've exerted executive order sanctions that come with a national emergency, 86% of the time, those sanctions have resulted in war. So that's how I started the institution. Along the way, I was then joined by some people that said, listen, comrade, you're doing a good job, but if you want this thing to work well, you need to join up with others, because the government would love to support the efforts that you are undertaking, and they would love to support you together with other people. And currently, you're a one-man show with your daughter and a South African. Why don't you come and we create one unit as Zimbabweans, since you say that we need to unite, and then we create an institution that government can support. So we went on, we formed that institution. I didn't want to look like Mbimbindoga. I didn't want to look like a one-man show. I didn't want to look like I want to do this alone. I had always wanted to be with other people, but other people just didn't seem interested in the fight. So when I joined this gentleman and a lady, we began to walk the journey together. But along the way, it seemed like the other gentlemen were hell-bent on trying to destabilize and to stop what I was doing. So right now we are on limbo in that particular organization, and I'm beginning to use ZASAM again to try and finish off the fight that we've already started, and that's almost coming to its culmination.
Okay, that's fantastic. And I would like to say you have been the most consistent campaigner against sanctions ever since I've known you. And a person like myself, I have been on the other side, where I thought the sanctions were actually good for Zimbabwe, but I've managed to turn around, and I think Mr. Jonasi too, because of the work that you've done, and that is fantastic stuff. Mr. Jonasi, I want to give you an opportunity to start off our topic for today. The UN rapporteur, or Envoy, who is in Zimbabwe currently now, is Elena Dohan. I hope I've got that correct. Are you aware of a visit? Are you aware of the itinerary that the government has put out for her visit?
Yes, I am aware, but I'm only worried that she's meeting government officials and the program ends either 11 a.m. or 12 a.m. I'm worried about what happens after, who is being met where and how. I think I was going to be more comfortable if the whole program is out there, including the civic society and the opposition, because most people I know that applied to meet here from the civic society never got even up to so far. They never have even a response. They are not even sure whether they are going to meet here or not. That's my worry, that there's a lot of mystery, but the government programs is out there.
Okay, I want to go to Mr. Rutendo because he's got a lot of background knowledge about how she managed to come to Zimbabwe. Can you tell us who is Elena and what are her powers? What is the scope of a visit to Zimbabwe, Mr. Rutendo?
Yeah, thank you so much. In 2017, the UN, after discussing the issue of sanctions, which they call unilateral coercive economic measures, decided to have a meeting in which they were going to create a resolution to actually start dealing with the issue of these unilateral sanctions or unilateral coercive economic measures through policy and through resolutions. So in 2017, they had a meeting in which they came up with a resolution to say that economic coercive measures are illegal. They deprive civilians of the enjoyment of their human rights. They stop the world from achieving the elimination of poverty, the provision of clean water, the Millennium Goals or the Sustainable Millennium Goals, development goals. The sanctions are stopping these from happening. So the UN decided that it's not going to keep giving lip services to the issues that are stopping development from taking place, but they're actually going to take action. And they wanted to take action to ensure that they give life to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and to ensure that every single human being on earth is not being hindered from enjoying their human rights because of man-made issues. So in 2017, a resolution was made and there was a vote within the Human Rights Council where we had 34 members agreeing to the resolutions of this particular meeting, and we had 13 members that did not agree, so the resolution passed. In this resolution, they said that first and foremost, unilateral coercive economic measures are illegal at international law. They're illegal in line with the UN Charter. And remember, the UN was created by the United States after the Second World War. The intention of creating the UN was that nations must not get to a point where they go to war, and a war that kills as many as 80 million people like what the Second World War did. So we need to create an institution that forces nations to talk their problems through, that forces nations to deal with their disputes in a multilateral institution where other nations can become adjudicators, where there are courts and structures that can be followed in order to deal with disputes between members of the UN. And it was also created to ensure that members of the institution can adhere to their agreements that they make in the international sphere, and also to honor human rights, because the Declaration of Human Rights was made part and parcel of the creation of the UN. So with that, it meant that this declaration, this resolution that was made in 2017 was giving life to the assurance that human rights are honored, civilians can enjoy their human rights all across the world without those human rights being taken away from them because of economic sanctions that are imposed by other nations upon other people without the authority of the UN. So with that resolution, it created the special rapporteur to be there to deal with the issue of sanctions. And there's also going to be a special rapporteur who can then go and look at the negative impacts of those sanctions. So that's two separate special rapporteurs. And so Elena exists specifically to measure the negative impact of sanctions. And the reason she goes around measuring the negative impact of sanctions is that this particular declaration said that countries should not use unilateral coercive measures. And when they do use unilateral coercive measures, other nations should avoid and try to find ways not to utilize the same third-party extrajudicial sanctions. And those that are under those unilateral coercive measures should find ways to avoid them. And the UN was given a task to measure the impact of these sanctions. After measuring the impact of these sanctions, they would then make recommendations to the UN as to how it is that any unilateral measures can be mitigated, and to quantify what has been the loss or the impact upon human rights so that there can be remedy, reparations, or compensation that is given by the countries that are imputing these sanctions so that it can deter them from utilizing such sanctions in future. So ELENA is in Zimbabwe to measure the negative impacts of sanctions, to give life to the fact that they're illegal, and then to look for remedies and measures to try and pressure the countries that are utilizing them from utilizing them, and to ensure that there is a remedy or reparations that can be paid to the civilians that have been suffering under these crimes against humanity, according to my books.
Okay, so Rutendo, that was amazing and well set out. I'll ask you a follow-up question afterwards, but I want to play a video of what the Minister of Justice said this morning about Elena's visit. Then Mr. Jonasi, please prepare to give us the negative impact of the sanctions after this video.
Just to brief you that we met the rapporteur, the special rapporteur is Minister of Justice, to give them an overview of the effect of sanctions. But I must add that we are not unable at the moment to give details of our deliberations with them. As you are aware, they are on a fact-finding mission to establish the extent of the effect of the sanctions on the ordinary people. So we deliberated, and I'm sure you are all aware that as a country, we are on a drive to ensure that the sanctions are removed. And we presented to them what we've done, be it in terms of our legislation, in terms of other measures to ensure that the effect of sanctions on the ordinary people is lessened. But at the moment, we are unable to give you final details because we want to allow the process of consultation that the rapporteur is doing to be concluded. Once she has finished, she will then have a press conference to give a preliminary report, and thereafter I think we can comment accordingly. From the point of view of the government of Zimbabwe, we want the sanctions removed because they've affected every facet of our life. So in a nutshell, our document that we are going to give them will clearly indicate the effects of sanctions on our society, and that is exactly what we want them to appreciate and understand and be able to capture, so that we can continue with our drive to ensure that the sanctions are removed. She's going to meet everyone who met us. So she's not meeting government alone. Even our paper is not about the effect on government, but on everyone. So if she requests to meet anyone, I think that can be facilitated through Foreign Affairs.
Right. I think it's very clear. The Minister of Justice has explained what Elena is here to do in Zimbabwe. Mr. Jonasi, when we say there are negative impacts of sanctions in Zimbabwe, what are they?
All right. Sanctions by intention, their objective is to suffocate the economy of the country, and in this case, obviously, a hungry man is an angry man. The strategy was, if Zimbabweans in an economic crisis, it will influence their voting patterns and choices, so that they would vote the opposition into power, in this case MDC. And so that is economic, and secondly, regime change. Then there's also issues to do with marriages. Marriage is the breakdown, because the modern marriages, they are also based on financial. Young people, young generation is ambitious. They want to buy cars, they want to do everything, and morality. We saw recently this program of Tinashe Mugabe, Mr. DNA. The whole country was on panic mode. And when the government said he's operating illegally, I think most people who are married felt very relieved. That is a sign that, and I think from the data from the DNA institutions in Zimbabwe, I think 70% of children who are tested in Zimbabwe are not of the fathers that are legally married to the mother. So if 70%, so I mean, everyone here must do a DNA test for your kids, because it's really a pandemic. more than the COVID-19. I mean,
okay, I'm hearing you, Mr. Jonas. You are saying there's an impact on the country, and then at a personal level, there's an impact of the sanctions.
Yeah.
But is that enough? Is that enough for the UN to take what is the material or financial impact of these sanctions?
Okay. In the case of Zimbabwe, the past 20 years, it's estimated that the sanctions have cost, Zimbabwe almost $42 billion US. And that is a huge amount in terms of if we were not affected at that level.
Okay. And I think that's clear. Now, Rutendo, let me come back to you. And I want to go back into the program of Elena, and also the outputs of what she's going to achieve in Zimbabwe. So if we look at her program in Zimbabwe, she's going to be here for about 10 to 11 days. That's correct, right?
Yeah, 10 days.
Correct.
Okay, so on my screen, I'm so sorry for the audience, because I don't think they'll be able to see the size of this screen. It's very small. On Monday, she's going to meet Foreign Affairs and International Trade. Then at 9:30, she met President Mnangagwa, and then she met the Minister of Justice, Legal and Parliamentary Affairs, Minister of Finance and Economic Development. So I think I'll put this up on the screen. You can see that she's got a lot of meetings here with people in the president's office, mines, justice and industry and commerce, provincial affairs, Bulawayo, and so on. So these I'll put this up on gambako.com. Lands, information and publicity, higher education, and so forth. What is the rationale behind this program, Rutendo?
Right. So first of all, I want to say that I can't comment about that program, because I don't know the efficacy of that program. I do not know if that program actually came from the special rapporteur herself or from government, because there's no logo, there is no signature, there are no security marks or features to prove where that document actually came from. And for me, as an anti-sanctions movement and a person that is also a specialist in communication and marketing, we understand that a document that has no authentic signature or mark to prove where it comes from can come from anywhere. And sanctions thrive on propaganda. They thrive on misinformation, psychological warfare. So I can't vouch for that, and I can't speak on the behalf of that. And part of our strategy in the anti-sanctions movement is obviously engaging with government and telling them, giving them our proposals. And we've been always saying government needs to learn to communicate transparently. They should have a portal that already deals with sanctions. That portal is the place that every Zimbabwean is supposed to be able to go to get information so that they don't have to depend on documents that are floating on the internet. So that's the first thing I wanted to say. So I don't know what the schedule of the special rapporteur is. We heard that she's going to meet civil society. We heard that she's going to meet churches. We heard that she's going to meet the opposition. We heard she's going to meet the US government and other embassies in the country, and none of those are on that sheet. And so that gives the impression that the special rapporteur has come to Zimbabwe to talk to the Zimbabwean government. And I do not believe that's the case, because the notes that are on the UN Human Rights website say that she's going to meet a cross-section of society that just doesn't include the government. And that particular schedule is just the government. And I believe it could be propaganda. So that's my issue with that.
Okay, I want to bring to your attention this post by Hopo Chingono. And he says here, Elena Dohan, her office is not funded by the United Nations. The Belarusian was invited by the regime and not by the United Nations. And the regime needs a report for propaganda purposes. It's clear that there are people in Zimbabwe who don't feel that she's on a serious visit. For example, Chingono has got quite a large following internationally. Can you answer to what he's saying here?
Well, quite frankly, what Chingono is saying is very false. It's very false because the UN Human Rights Council is part of the institutions of the UN, with the Economic Council, the International Court of Justice, and a number of other institutions that are in the UN. So you've got the General Assembly, you've got the Security Council, the Human Rights Council. Those are integral parts of the UN, funded by the UN. The members of the UN Human Rights Council are actually elected by the General Assembly, and an election happened on the 13th, in which the United States, together with, I think, Switzerland, were elected and in that particular Human Rights Council that Chingono is talking about. And that Human Rights Council is the one that has given the mandate to the Special Rapporteur for her to actually come to do these assessments. And remember, her position is empowered by a resolution, HRC 3413. So she is a legally constituted position that is supposed to go out there to enforce that resolution and its implementation to end the use of unilateral coercive economic measures. So putting it pretty simply, Chingono is lying, or Chingono is absolutely ignorant of how the UN works, because the UN Human Rights Council is the body created by the UN to supervise and adjudicate issues of human rights abuses. Hence, we always say that if the Americans felt that Zimbabwe was abusing human rights, they should have gone to the UN Human Rights Council that consists of 47 nations of former colonizers and colonized peoples, who would then come together in fairness and without conflict of interest to make a decision as to whether Zimbabwe is violating human rights, the same way that it was done with Rhodesia, when that time it was given to the Human Rights Committee, who decided that Rhodesia was perpetrating a crime against humanity and that sanctions should be imposed on Rhodesia. And Rhodesia still had the opportunity to answer for itself in the General Assembly. And if it was not happy with the decision of the General Assembly, it could have lobbied members of the Security Council. If it was not happy with the decisions of the Security Council, it could have still gone to the International Court of Justice or the Court of Arbitration to get a legal decision and legal guidance on the decision. And Zimbabwe hasn't been offered that. So bottom line, Elena is employed by the UN. She has been given a mandate by a law made by the UN Human Rights Council. She's legitimate, and her findings will be binding. And whatever comes out of this shall be something that the country must be able to use to go forward to bring down this illegality.
Okay. Rutendo, I'm still going to come back to you on that. What is her output? Is she going to, because the government of Zimbabwe has presented her with a document. When she finishes her consultations, who is she reporting to? And they say she's going to have a press conference. Is the press conference the output, or is there going to be a recommendation to the United Nations? Which body of the United Nations? And is that binding on America? if she gives a recommendation?
Right. So first and foremost, what is going to happen is that she has been given documents from various people. There was an open invitation to anybody and everybody to write their own reports, giving an assessment of the negative impacts of sanctions that they have experienced. I think there's also room for those that want to give their own positive influences to it. Like, for instance, the countries that have imposed the sanctions themselves, they have an opportunity to also tell the positives that they have done. And then Elena is supposed to collate all this information. She's supposed to go out into the public to meet civil society, to meet people all across Zimbabwe, in schools, in rural communities, in urban communities, in churches, excuse me. And she's supposed to gather as much information and evidence, tangible evidence, that is going to try and determine what is the impact of these sanctions in Zimbabwe. And remember, her job is to look at the negative impacts. So that's what she'll be looking at. And as somebody who's got experience doing this in Cuba and other countries, she's going to know which markers to look at. Because remember, the fundamental human rights that people have are social, cultural, economic, political, legal, and I think I've got them all. Yeah, social, okay. I've gone there, and cultural, Right. So she's going to go and look to see whether there's been an impact on our economy. There's been an impact in our social. There's been an impact in the hospitals, in food, in water delivery systems, and in the means by which people get their basic services. She's going to go to schools and try and see whether the standards of education in Zimbabwe before sanctions and after sanctions have changed anything. She's probably going to look at death rates and look at whether more people have died ever since the sanctions came about, whether there's more sicknesses, the mortality rate. Those are the kind of things she's going to look at. She needs tangible evidence to determine through a correlation coefficient whether there's cause and effect of the sanctions and whether there's a measurability of the impact of these sanctions on Zimbabweans. Then she will have a press conference to give what is called a preliminary report. The preliminary report is just a prima facie evidence of what she's seen, and she's giving a statement on that. But she's going to take all the documents, all the notes. If she's given any more documents on her trips, she's going to then take that to the UN Human Rights Council, which is constituted of those 47 nations that include the Americans. And then they're going to sit over this work, they're going to sift through it, and they're going to come up with conclusions as to what they feel. And remember, that Human Rights Council is assisted by a court which has got advisors who can give legal advice to the Human Rights Council onto some of the conclusions that they're going to make. And then they'll present this in September next year to the to the UN. But I want to say this: the fact that the special rapporteur of the UN Human Rights Council has come to Zimbabwe to investigate unilateral coercive economic measures, which the UN Human Rights Council has pronounced as illegal, as a violation of the UN Charter, and as something that violates the enjoyment of human rights by civilians, automatically means that there is an indictment on the sanctions that are in Zimbabwe, and they are deemed to be illegal and a violation of human rights. The only thing that is happening now is a measurement of the effect upon human rights. And before I finish, I must also just point out that the United States itself is already undertaking an impact assessment on human rights. They've got a congressional subcommittee for human rights, health, and organization that is already undertaking an impact assessment after pressure from people like myself. And they are trying to see the impact of the US sanctions on health and human rights, not only in Zimbabwe anymore, but the whole of Africa, which has never happened before. And the Americans were saying that the sanctions don't impact the people of Zimbabwe. But how did they reach that conclusion when they're only doing the impact assessment 20 years after the sanctions?
Okay. I know you are very knowledgeable about sanctions. And I know you're having a live discussion in a panel on the 20th. And I hope that we'll bring this here live to hear more about the sanctions in Zimbabwe. Is she only looking at ZIDERA sanctions, or which other sanctions is she looking at?
There are a number of sanctions that are on Zimbabwe. It's unfortunate that most Zimbabweans only know the ZIDERA sanctions, but She's going to look at the 2001 ZIDERA sanctions. She's going to come from there. She's going to look at the 2002 European sanctions that were imposed after the chief of the European monitors was dismissed from Zimbabwe in 2002 after interfering with causing propaganda and misinformation before the presidential elections. She's going to look at the 2003 executive order sanctions 13288. She's going to look at the sanctions of 2005, which were an amendment to the 13288 that is now looking at 13391. And she's also going to look at the sanctions of the executive orders of 2008, in which the government of Zimbabwe was included in the executive order sanctions, together with its parastatals, its companies, local municipalities, and a number of private entities, plus the so-called targeted 144 special designated nationals, anyone who does business with them, and anyone who does business with those who do business with them, and so forth and so on. So basically, sanctions on the whole of Zimbabwe. She's going to look at the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, which is the legal weapon that is actually a defense and war weapon that is being used to implement these sanctions, which is basically a general law that says that any country upon which the United States has declared a national emergency is a threat to the United States economically, security-wise. There is a weapon that needs to be used, an economic weapon, to weaken the threat and to destroy that threat. And in the event that that threat cannot be destroyed with the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, another national emergency can be called upon to eventually put boots on the ground. So she's going to be looking at all these and how it is that they've impacted Zimbabwe and how it is that they've affected people's lives.
Okay, I want to give you a break and I'll go to Mr. Jonasi. And if we were to do a vote right now, half of the young people in Zimbabwe would say the sanctions are not harming ordinary people. And I want to go back to that question that I asked you. Why is it young people in Zimbabwe don't understand the impact of the sanctions? If you were to take a vote now on Facebook, you probably find that half of them will say the sanctions are deserved. ZANU-PF has called this upon themselves. Corruption is the problem. Why do you think this is the situation in Zimbabwe? Mr. Jonas?
All right. For me, I think there's a number of ways. First, ZANU-PF versus MDC. I think for the past years, the opposition has done very well or dominated ZANU-PF in terms of social media policy. Secondly, I think there's a need of an improvement in government communication, because the opposition is amplifying their narrative. But also at the same time, we should also remember that international media is on the side of the opposition. So no matter also how the government tries to communicate the original narrative, they are they're being overwhelmed, because we know that there's BBC, CNN, Al Jazeera, SABC, the international, superpowers, they've got more budgets to buy your Peter Ndoros, your Sophie Mukwena. So yeah, I think the government is also overwhelmed, and we saw how hashtag Zimbabwean Lives Matter took over the world. Those are huge funding. So I think that's what I can say. The government is besieged in terms of communication budgets, and media, like in South Africa, we know that it's run by the same people, the Ruperts and the other people. So hence, South Africa as a government, their foreign policy on Zimbabwe, it's very friendly and neighborly. But one would wonder why state broadcaster like SABC is very negative on any issue concerning Zimbabwe. Yeah, those are, I think, effects of the budgets Negative stories about countries like Zimbabwe, they are hugely funded. So I can say, and also I think, as I said, the ZANU-PF also must improve on social media policy. I don't think.
I think, Mr. Jonasi, that is clear. And Rutendo has written a letter. I think 2 days or 3 days ago, I saw a letter that he wrote to SABC. So I don't want us to touch on that issue today. I will leave it for a future discussion. My question is not on the communication, and I want to take this to Rutendo. Young Zimbabweans don't buy. So they don't buy the fact that these sanctions are because of America just coming to impose them on Zimbabwe. Young people believe that ZANU-PF caused the sanctions of themselves. If you look at the comments that we have here, we've got 112 comments here. Many young people say these sanctions were deserved. Explain to me why these sanctions are not deserved. Rutendo.
Right, thanks a lot. So first of all, I want to say that one of the biggest problems that people have is they don't understand how sophisticated sanctions are. There's a guy who is by the name of ZIDERA. He worked with the US Treasury in 2001 when he decided to start using economic weapons or sanctions as a form of warfare that is actually much more effective than going to attack nations. And ZIDERA says in this write-up that we have been using sanctions as the United States ever since we got our country in 1776. And he says that they've successfully used sanctions against the biggest countries, including the British and including Japan and Germany during the Second World War, to either draw them into war and to defeat them in order to take over the financial system of the world. So he says that we use financial weapons because they are imperceptible. The citizens of countries do not understand them. Our own citizens in the United States don't see us being an aggressor. So when we use economic sanctions, they cause a country to break up from within, and the people in that country not to understand that the problem is our sanctions, but it is their governments. So this is no different to Zimbabwe. Young people, lots of them, are actually very uninformed. The education system is very disinformative. It does not educate people. It does not open up people's reasoning. So when they are given these sanctions and they're given a communication rhetoric by the United States, it becomes believable because there's no counter and there's no knowledge about how sanctions work. And because they hit the economy, very few people are economists. Very few people understand how the economy works, or even the social fiber works, or the psychological elements. So it requires a psychologist, economist, politician, and so many other specialities to understand sanctions. So that's why they use them. And that's why you saw me starting to talk, starting to communicate, to educate those young people. And let me correct something. It's not only young people that don't understand the sanctions and think that the sanctions are deserved. Our own government thinks, or used to think, that these sanctions were deserved. Hence, you would hear Mutuli Ncube now and again saying that they are reforming to these sanctions and the Americans are not removing them. Mutuli Ncube failed to understand that the sanctions are illegal, so he doesn't have to reform to illegal sanctions. And in a democracy, you do not reform to foreign pressure. You must reform to what it is that your own citizens want, and that the UN Charter says that no nation can interfere internally. So what needs to happen is that we need the government to start communicating a lot more better to educate the citizens. That number one, the sanctions that are imposed on Zimbabwe are imposed on people that were never tried in any court. They were never given an opportunity to defend themselves. They were never given an opportunity to cross-examination the claims that they abuse human rights. And so therefore they were found guilty without trial, and then they were punished by sanctions. And that in its own self is a violation of the Bill of Rights and a crime against humanity. We must also then go and state that the United States, the UK, and the European Union are all member states of the UN. They are equal, and they are children like everyone else in the UN body. They do not have the authority or jurisdiction to be judge, jury, and court on disputes with other nations, because then that brings us back to the unilateralism that the United States created the UN to get rid of. So they have no right to impose sanctions punishment or any other form of punishment on any country because they don't have that authority. Number three, their sanctions impact human rights. They impact the civilians' ability to enjoy their basic rights, rights to water, rights to food, rights to healthcare, rights to medicine, rights to economic development, even rights to democratic right to choose a political party gets taken away when people are being punished, when they are being denied food, water, and jobs so that they can feel the pain and vote for the opposition. That takes away the democratic and political rights of Zimbabweans. And so that's the current situation we have in Zimbabwe. That's what makes them illegal, irrespective of how we feel. Many people hate ZANU-PF. Many people are not happy with ZANU-PF. But that does not change the rule of law that says that no one has the right to punish another nation or to punish another nation in a way that is going to punish civilians. And now think about it from a common sense perspective. The United States, the Europeans, and the UK are saying they are punishing people who violated civilian human rights in Zimbabwe, but they go and they put sanctions that punish the very same civilians and make those very same civilians feel pain. And this brings me to the last point. The Americans and the United Kingdom and the Europeans are saying, we impose these sanctions because of human rights violations, which we said have never been proved in court. But they also said we are putting them so that the Zimbabwean government can implement the Zimbabwean constitution of 2013. But if that constitution was written by a combination of ZANU-PF and MDC members who came into the parliament by the utilization of this crime against humanity that was depriving people of water, depriving people of food, depriving people of development, to force them to vote for MDC. These people were terrorized by a crime against humanity to vote for MDC MPs that then went into COPAC that then created our constitution. So now the question is the constitution the people's constitution, or it is the sanctions constitution? We also then need to ask ourselves, and you must remember that it's not only sanctions that were used, but in 2008, the Americans used Nelson Mandela, Kofi Annan, and Gracia Machel to come and threaten Zimbabwe that if you do not have a unity government, then the NATO is going to invade, it's going to remove ZANU-PF and put MDC. And that's after MDC officials had gone to ask for an invasion of Zimbabwe in 2008. So this constitution that the Americans are pushing us to implement, is it our constitution? Were the clauses that were put in that constitution put by the Zimbabwean people? And those clauses that were put in that constitution, do they serve the interests of Zimbabwe, or the politicians that put them were afraid and threatened by sanctions and wanted sanctions to go, so they listened to what the sanction senders wanted them to put in that constitution? The reason I ask these questions is that when we started talking about the compensation of white farmers, Zimbabweans went up in arms because they didn't know that that was part of their constitution. They didn't know that they will have to compensate white farmers for stolen land. And for those who bought it after independence, they bought stolen land, and they didn't know, Zimbabweans didn't know they have to compensate those people. Yet those people never paid reparations for 90 years of colonialism, and then land was never returned to its rightful owners. Zimbabweans were also unhappy with the clause that says, if you come into parliament with a political party, and if you change sides, then that political party can recall you. Zimbabweans were unhappy with that. They were unhappy again with the issue of the running mate clause, and a number of other things that make us doubt that Zimbabweans contributed to this constitution. So can the United States use a crime against humanity to force us to implement a constitution that came about through a crime against humanity and members of parliament who forced their way into parliament by the terrorism of sanctions?
Okay, Rutendo, I could listen to you talking about sanctions for the whole day. And unfortunately, let's wrap this up. It's midweek. People need to go and sleep and go to work. I want to go to Mr. Jonasi before I end with Rutendo. Let's say sanctions were to be removed today. What are some of the immediate benefits that Zimbabwe would get? Mr. Jonasi.
Yeah, I want the viewers to know that there is a link. Banks across the world, they have got links. And if someone is in United States of America want to transfer money to a Zimbabwean bank, there's always a communication of banks. And the US controls a lot in terms of that. And also, there are so many countries and companies in the world that also do business with the American companies or American government. They are also afraid to be punished if they do business with Zimbabwe. So by lifting sanctions, Zimbabwe would access financial markets, favorable trade agreements, but there are companies which are afraid of US. We know US is a political bully and they love war. So right now we can say Zimbabwe is isolated in terms of business, and yeah, so that would be the biggest benefit that Zimbabwe would do. It will be out of isolation, and it will do well, because right now the restrictions are stifling the every economic activity ambitions.
Okay, so Rutendo, I want to come back to you, and this is the very last question. Why not go directly? So the government of Zimbabwe, why not go directly to the Americans and negotiate with them? The Taliban right now is negotiating directly with America. What is stopping President Mnangagwa and his government from going to the United States, Joe Biden's government, and negotiate with them over sanctions?
Thank you for that question. It's unfortunate that when we started the discussion, we didn't start where I usually want to start off, which is giving the historical context of what happened with Zimbabwe to be where it is and for it to be a country that is put under sanctions. But basically, when you look at the conditions that ZIDERA has, the conditions are basically saying Zimbabwe must go back to a recolonization mode. We must go back to a situation where white and European or Western individuals or companies own our land, control our land. We must go into a situation where property rights are respected. When you look at colonial speak or imperialist speak, property rights means white people's rights to own what it is that they took during a crime against humanity of colonialism. So we must restore that. From that, they say that we must liberalize our economy and our country for competition and fair competition. That means that they might even want to review certain contracts and deals that were acquired during what was called indigenization, including our cellular networks, including the licenses that were given for mining. They might want that to be reviewed. They are also very vague on what it is that they call a political interest or foreign policy interests that they say we are threatening. Hence, they put the executive order sanctions. And I see that as the Americans probably wanting a military base in Zimbabwe for their foreign policy interests to be satisfied. And I don't think Zimbabwe is able to give the Americans a lot of what they want. Compensation of white farmers and the return of land to white farmers is also something that the Zimbabwean government cannot do. And so when you look at all these things that the Americans seem to have put sanctions for, these are the things that Mnangagwa would need to be willing to give to them if he goes through a negotiation process through the political system. And that is why some of us have had to approach the government through our proposals to say, you need to stop fighting sanctions politically only. You need to start taking the issue of politics the issue of sanctions from politics into the level playing field of legal multilateralism. The reason being, as long as Zimbabwe is a small little country that was liberated not too long ago, that is controlled by black people, who the Europeans and Western countries need to exploit as a parasite for them to continue to maintain their domination in the world, it would mean that Zimbabwe will have to capitulate to that in the political space. By the West giving in to what Zimbabwe wants, that will mean they've lost the political war. So that's why we're saying take that fight away from politics, put it on the legal front, put it in the multilateral institution space where you have got adjudicators, international law, and human rights law to regulate. And ever since the government has gone into that direction, approaching the UN, you have seen the Americans beginning to give more concessions than they've ever given in the past 20 years. And they've given concessions to Zimbabwe that they've never given to any other country in history. Like, for instance, the impact assessment that they're doing now. They're only doing an impact assessment because they know that we want to take them to international courts. And they understand that if they lose in international courts, if they are proved by a little country like Zimbabwe that they successfully demonized, that they actually are breaking rule of law in Zimbabwe, it vindicates Zimbabwe. It vindicates Zimbabwe's land reform. It vindicates the position of Zimbabwe in the eyes of the world, and it lowers the Americans and the European stance in the world as bullies that want to try and bully smaller countries. So this is what they're trying to avoid. They're trying to avoid us going to international court and getting a decision like what Iran did in 2018. They are hoping that we'll keep it under covers. And let me say one thing. Remember that America has already lost cases to Zimbabwean companies in the international court space. Many Zimbabweans don't know that. But Zimbabwe has won many international cases, hence ZB Bank are no longer under sanctions, Intermarket are no longer under sanctions, and a number of other institutions. That was defeats of the Americans in the international court. CBZ also defeated them. Now, we've got that precedence already. The Americans don't want us to use that precedent. Hence, when I spoke to that lady from the CIA, I was able to push her to say, you must recommend to Congress that they must undertake impact assessments. Now those impact assessments are there, and the UN is going to come with its impact assessments of negative impacts of these sanctions. The next drive is reparations, damages, compensation. They want us to compensate white farmers. They're going to have to compensate Zimbabwe for the crime against humanity they've visited for the past 20 years. So these are the positives that we have with the current situation that we've got.
Okay, I think this debate would go on for a very long time, and as you can see, young people in the media space, they're starting to see that it's important for sanctions to be removed. I think the government has done a better job among the influencers in Zimbabwe. I've never seen an influencer in Zimbabwe who says sanctions must stay. And I hope that this flows down to the ordinary Zimbabwean so that everyone starts saying sanctions must go. Mr. Jonasi, is there anything else you want to say before we close?
First, in terms of these sanctions, I want to thank Rutendo. You can see his passion when he's talking about sanctions. I think it's all for us, people, young generations, to emulate and to be inspired. Then, secondly, I wonder even why Rutendo is not in Zimbabwe. Probably invited even by the government of Zimbabwe to present or to contribute and or to engage the Envoy, the special Envoy. I wonder. Yeah, and then maybe Rutendo is going to clarify why he's not part of the people who are engaging the special Envoy.
Rutendo, can you clarify that? Why are you not in Zimbabwe? Good question, Mr. Jonas.
I think the issue of fighting sanctions is a team effort. I have submitted my report. The report is sitting with the special rapporteur. I've also submitted my report to strategic institutions within Zimbabwe. I think they're pretty good enough to articulate what it is that needs to be articulated. But having said that, I also can't hide away from the fact that there are people in Harare that have got political ambitions that see people like Rutendo as a threat. They think that if we are able to stand out in what it is that we've been doing from outside government, maybe government, if it puts us inside, if it embraces us, then their jobs are under threat. And I would like to use this platform to just basically say that a person like myself doesn't have political ambitions. What I do is uniting the nation, building the brand Zimbabwe. And after I have finished building brand Zimbabwe, I want to move on to building brand Africa and other brands in Africa for us to bring in African unity. So I don't have time to be a politician on the ground in Zimbabwe because people like myself, I'm a Moyo Chirandu, I'm a custodian of what it is that we were given by our ancestors. And so I don't have time for that. So I just wanted to also lay this down because a lot of people feel threatened by Rutendo, thinking that Rutendo wants to come and take my position. So they keep us as far away as possible from the limelight or from decision makers within government because they think we want something from them. Hence, there were those two gentlemen I told you sent to come and destroy my institution because they were instructed to do that because this Rutendo is a problem. And I'm not a problem. I don't want anybody's position. I'm not a politician. I am happy just building Africa.
Okay. I would like to dig deeper into that in private. Not here. So the thing which you mentioned that you are Moyo Chirandu, there's two of us here. I hope Mr. Jonas is not a Moyo Chirandu.
Me, I'm the superior one, Mofium Kono.
Okay, good. All right. So sanctions are evil. Sanctions are like witchcraft. Those are the words that I've seen being used. I feel pain when I see sanctions. I was in Zimbabwe a few weeks back, and it's clear that that country has got so much potential. And Rutendo, I want to give you the last word so that we can then put you live on the 20th when you're in the panel. Is there anything else you want to say about this before we close?
Yeah, I just wanted to say that as Zimbabweans, we've got a reputation of being very educated. And I think that our education has been put to question in the aspect that it is people like Rutendo who had to come and start talking about the legalization of the fight against sanctions in a country where we've got lawyers, and I'm not a lawyer. I think it's very sad that I had to explain to people that sanctions are a violation of human rights. It's almost like Zimbabweans did not believe that they're human beings, and therefore they did not believe that they should be enforcing their rights or their human rights, even in the face of America. So I would like to encourage Zimbabweans to start reading. I would like to encourage Zimbabweans to start understanding human rights law, international law, so that they begin to know what it is that is due to them. I also want Zimbabweans to start looking at the aspect that we must claim our humanity back by ending these sanctions and seeking reparations, damages, and compensation for these sanctions. And if the United States cannot compensate us, we should not compensate white farmers. And once we have gotten this compensation, we must use that compensation to build our capacity to produce. Zimbabweans sometimes consume much more than they produce, making sanctions easier and more effective on us. I think we should change our minds. And I want to say something to Zimbabwean men. It is your responsibility to serve your nation, defend your women and children, defend your grandmothers and grandfathers, defend your parents. It cannot be that you're a Zimbabwean man and you're the one running to a foreign country, an enemy, white men who are building their own country for their own children, and you're calling them to come and destroy your country so that you can have a few cents in your pockets. My question is, if you are willing to do that, why don't you just bend over and let those other men sleep with you as well? Because clearly you are not a man. Men die for their nation, men serve their nation, and that's our responsibility. And we as Zimbabwean men, people like BT can't call themselves men. People like Chamisa and anyone else calling for sanctions can't call themselves men when they are not defending their country with all their might. Many people have said, Rutendo, you're going to be killed. The Americans will kill you. I'm ready to die. My job is done. I have created the awareness I wanted. I've created the message that we must shout from rooftops. I've talked about how this is a crime against humanity and illegal. That message is done. I've done my job. I've defended my nation. And maybe if need be, when we have to go and fight with guns, if they don't kill me before that, I'm ready to fight with a gun for children, women, and the people of Zimbabwe.
Okay, one last question, Rutendo. People have been asking if they can have your number, and I was reluctant to give it. Do you want us to give this number, or they can get you on Facebook and other platforms?
You can give them my number. They can definitely get a hold of me on WhatsApp, and they can definitely get a hold of me on Facebook. But please, can I only have people who are serious about doing something for Zimbabwe? I'm not here to complain. I'm not here to ask what Zimbabwe does for me. I'm here to do for Zimbabwe because that country has given me so much. I'm educated, knowledgeable. I can read and write because of that country. I didn't die at the age of 5 because of the healthcare system that country gave me. So I want only to talk to people that are interested in doing something for their country.
Thank you very much, Rutendo, and thank you very much, Mr. Tinashe Jonasi. And we'll have you live here on the 20th during the panel discussion, which has been organized on sanctions. Thank you very much, gents, and good night.
Thank you.
Thank you. Good night.
This is not politics. This is a ghetto soldier's cry. And this is legality, which knows that. How do you punish certain people without a trial? Everybody's innocent to proven guilty, so I apply the law any other way. Yo, sanctions are illegal, the which knows that. how do you punish certain people without a trial? Everybody's innocent to proven guilty, so I apply the law. Yo, listen. Africa should stand firm, it is the future. The West is falling and they can't have us wrong. Zimbabwe at the forefront, we took the land. Sanctions are not working, they're hitting poor man. I got a family in Africa that tells me otherwise. This is not politics, nor is it rocket science. It's all about the people that are getting raw deal, being punished as collective with bad politicians. Sanctions are illegal, the West knows that. How do you punish certain people without a trial? Everybody's innocent to proven guilty, so I apply the law any other way. Yo, sanctions are illegal, the West knows that. How do you punish certain people without a trial? Everybody's innocent to proven guilty, so I apply the law. Yo, listen. This is a crime against humanity. Civilians should never suffer, denied basic rights, but the sanctions from the West are doing just that. What the people they are targeting live a good life. Is objective being achieved? No, so take away the sanctions and try something else. If it's loving God for Africa, the million other ways got the sanctions do more harm than good. Hey, Babylon. Sanctions are illegal, the West knows that. How do you punish certain people without a trial?
Ay, 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 uyo, uko, kuno, apo, pano, mamuona kere.